In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Nebula Knight build. This is a level 150 Knight build that uses intelligence and dexterity in order to achieve great results. So first up, let's talk about the weapon that we're using for this build. For this build, we're using the Wing of Astel, which is a curved sword that deals physical and magic damage, and its weapon skill, Nebula, is extremely deadly. It shoots out kind of like a bunch of stars or star clusters that then detonate after like a second or so, each dealing individual damage. And what's really great about this ability is that it's 100% magic damage, meaning you can boost it very easily with Magic Shroud and Crack Tier and Magic Scorpion Charm, get like a lot of damage boost that way, or using something like Terra Magica as well. And also the stars tend to hit in like a wide area if you're out in the open, but they group up if you're in like tight corridors. So if you can lure an enemy or something into a tight corridor and then cast this, they'll all stay really grouped up on top of each other, and then you'll just hit that enemy over and over with that ability. Another really cool thing about the Wing of Astel as well is it has a rather unique R2. The animation of it is pretty much similar to other curved swords, but it shoots out little waves that deal independent damage from the blade itself. And if you charge it, you'll actually get 2 of them in a row. What this allows you to do is hit an enemy from point blank with the weapon and the waves that come out, not unlike something like Moonveil. If you hit them with the wave from Transient Moonlight and the sword itself, you'll deal increased damage. It's something similar here. And so you want to try and use these charged R2s when you're on top of enemies in order to deal substantial damage. And a lot of times this will stagger them as well, allowing you to get a critical strike. And since we're using the Assassin Cerulean Dagger, you're going to gain a lot of FP back when you do that. It's particularly interesting because when I was initially theory crafting for this build with the Wing of Astel, which I've been doing for some time, I always thought that I would use dual curved swords with this, like maybe a cold infused bandit curved sword in the offhand or scavenger's curved sword for a little bit of bleed as well. Thinking that, you know, you can hit over and over with the dual curved sword attacks, stack up some like attack buffs from like Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prothesis, something like that, and then use Wing of Astel for massive damage. But basically what I found is Wing of Astel is so powerful on its own, and because of the unique charged R2 that you're going to be using with this weapon a lot, you don't tend to do a lot of dual wield attacks when using it because you're really leaning into that Ash of War or weapon skill, and you're really leaning into that charged R2. So I was like, why am I actually dual wielding when I started playing around with this build, which is why I ended up putting a shield there and just kind of going the block counter route and using the, you know, weapon skill and the charged R2 as often as I could. That doesn't mean that you can't play with dual curved swords. It's definitely a viable way to play with Wing of Astel. If you use like a cold infused something in your left hand, you'll have similar scaling. You'll get frostbite buildup as well, which is great. But I kind of like the Knight playstyle, and I just found it a little bit unnecessary to use dual wield for this. Additionally, I'm using the Carrion Glint Blade Staff. I don't even have this upgraded. Really, the reason I'm using this one is because it has very light weight at 2.5, and it allows me to cast Scholar's Shield on my shield, which increases the guard boost and protection of the shield, which is fantastic because it doesn't have like the greatest guard boost ever, so getting that 25% increase is good. And I also have the Carrion Knight Shield in my left hand. I have that maxed out. It's a really good shield for low strength builds. We don't really use strength with this build at all, so it's not bad. Ideally with a block counter build, you'd have a great shield in order to get enemies rebuffing and make it easier to do block counters. So if you want to use a great shield, you can use one that's, you know, low strength and substitute it out. But I kind of like the look of this shield, and I don't have too much trouble with block counters in general. So that's kind of up to you. When it comes to armor for this build, I'm using the Great Helm, and then the rest of the pieces are from the Scale armor set. And really the reason for this is to get good protection, but also really good poise. I also happen to like the look of this armor set. You don't have to use this armor set. But we hit the breakpoint of 56 poise here. This is basically any regular attack you'll pretty much poise through, which gives you the opportunity to use the Nebula ability without getting staggered out of it in a lot of cases, or to use that charged R2 with your, special R2 waves without getting staggered out of it a lot of the time. When it comes to talismans for this build, I have the Magic Scorpion Charm, the Assassin Cerulean Dagger, Shard of Alexander, and Curved Sword Talisman. The Magic Scorpion Charm is great for this build because, as I mentioned, the waves that come out from the R2 and Charged R2 are all magic damage, and Nebula is 100% magic damage, and your regular attacks deal about 50 to 60% magic damage, so you're going to get like a 6% increase on those roughly in terms of total damage. So you're going to use this a lot in this build, and it's just going to help, stack damage when you're using those abilities and that Charged R2. The Assassin Cerulean Dagger is great here. We don't have a lot of points in mind. We have about 20 points, so we don't have a ton of FP pool. And this is going to allow you to keep on going. You can gain FP back by staggering things with block counters, or staggering them with a charged R2, or staggering them with Nebula, etc. So it's really good in fights like, when you're on the landscape. I would swap it out for something like, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman if you're in a boss fight that you're not really going for staggers on. But if you, are just out there fighting regular enemies, it's fantastic. Shard of Alexander is there to boost the damage of Nebula even further. This ability already hits extremely hard. This is going to give you an extra 15% damage, which is great. And lastly, we have the Curved Sword Talisman. This increases your block counter damage by about 20%. If you don't find yourself doing too many block counters, I would suggest switching this out for something like the Axe Talisman to give your charged R2 attacks more damage. Keep in mind, if you're using the Axe Talisman, it doesn't increase the waves that hit damage, but it'll increase the actual sword when it connects with the target's damage. Or you could use something like the Dagger Talisman to increase your critical strike attack. So when you do a block counter and staggered enemy and you go in for that critical, you deal increased damage as well. Those are all options that are good for this build. So generally the way this build plays as I'm like going around the landscape and stuff, I'll generally do block counters on regular enemies as long as they're not all together in a pack. But if they are kind of grouped up, you can use Nebula to just wipe them out really, really easily because it hits in such like a 120 degree or so arc that will take out big packs of enemies. It's good for that situation. Or if you want to throw it up early on a difficult enemy that's being aggressive charging at you, then you can do your charged R2 into them when Nebula detonates, and that a lot of times stagger them right then and there. Then you can follow that up with a critical strike, which works really, really well. I like to buff with Scholar's Shield fairly regularly. I wouldn't say you need to do it with like all the regular enemies, but if you're going to be fighting a tough enemy, it's a good thing to do to get that extra guard boost. You don't have a ton of points in endurance, so you don't have a ton of stamina with this build, and that will help, reduce the amount of stamina that gets consumed when you're blocking, which is good, and you can regain FP again with Assassin's Cerulean Dagger to recoup a lot of that cost as well. And Terra Magica is one that's kind of hard to use with this build. It's really only good if enemies are aggressive and you can throw it down before you aggro them, so that when they do become aggressive, you can stand in it and spam Nebula, or, throw up Nebula and then do your charged R2 into enemies. So it's not something you're going to use all the time, but it's good to have when you need it. In terms of the stats that I have for this build, I have 49 Vigor, 20 Mind, 25 Endurance, 12 Strength, 50 Dexterity, 50 Intelligence, 14 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You really don't need any Faith, Arcane, or Strength for this build. Those are just there because I started as the Confessor class. So if you started as something like a Prisoner or Astrologer or something like that, you'll probably have a much better stat spread that allow you to get some more Mind or even some more Endurance. If you want to use heavier armor, or you can even put it in Intelligence and Dexterity if you want to get a little bit more damage as well, even though it kind of drops off after those points that I've stopped. 49 Vigor is there because you are going to get hit with this build. Sometimes you'll trade damage when you're poising through attacks to use Nebula. Nebula spam is extremely deadly, so trading damage there usually comes out in your favor, especially if you can hit with a lot of the explosions, because typically you'll stagger an enemy before they can kill you, and then you have time to heal up and get like a critical strike in there. 20 Mind is a little bit lower than I'd like, so again, if you have a different class, you'll probably have more points available here. You could probably get this to 25 or 30 depending on what class you are, and that would be a lot better. This will allow you to use Nebula a lot more frequently and to buff with spells like Scholar's Shield or Terra Magica without having to use as many blue flasks. Keep in mind that the charged R2 and R2 attacks don't consume any FP, so you don't use as much FP as you'd think, but when you're in a boss encounter and you're just going ham with spamming Nebula, you don't want to run out of FP and have to back away to chug a flask after like 4 casts when you could finish it off with like another 2 casts. So getting that FP up would be good if you are a different class. Endurance is at 25 for this build. This allows us to medium roll and still use this heavy armor and shield, etc. You can probably get away with like 24 endurance, but I think I'm like a point more than what I actually need for this. But having extra stamina doesn't hurt, so I just left it there. When it comes to Dexterity and Intelligence, this is really the soft cap right here for this weapon. After 50 in each of these stats, it really starts to drop off in terms of the damage that you deal with. Something interesting with this weapon is that Intelligence affects the wave damage from R2 and Charged R2, as well as Nebula's damage, but Strength and Dexterity does not. So if you're not really doing block counters at all, and if you're not really using a lot of R1s, but you're just using Nebula, or you're finding that you're using the waves from Charged R2 more than anything, you'd probably be better off dropping Dexterity down to like 20 and putting Intelligence up to 80 in order to maximize that wave damage and maximize Nebula's damage if you want. You'll have less block counter damage that way and less regular attack damage, but those will be stronger. And that would also give you the option to be like a Spellblade as well. You could actually then increase, upgrade your staff in your right hand, maybe pick a better staff that has better scaling like Carrion Regal Scepter or something like that, and use spells as well if you want with this build. I personally like the Knight playstyle with this build, so I didn't do it that way, but if that's the way you want to do it, that's totally fine. And one final tip for this build, if you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique with it, I strongly recommend using the magic one. As I mentioned, Nebula and the charged R2 and R2 attacks are pure magic damage, so it's going to benefit those really well. And then I like the Green Burst Crystal tier as well for stamina recovery. If you're blocking with a shield, you want to get your stamina back. And if you're doing Nebula spam, you want to get your stamina back. You really can never have enough stamina, so it's just really good all around to have. Another good option, if you don't want to use that one, is using the one that increases your intelligence in order to increase the damage of Nebula and your R2 attacks. So that wraps up our Nebula Knight build. I'm going to keep trying to get builds out to you guys in between the weapon videos. I hope you guys are enjoying that series. Seems like people are. Remember to leave tips in those videos if I missed anything. There's a lot of information about weapons. It's hard to get it all into a video. So if you guys have tips, make sure you leave them in the comments below.